Welcome, Kyra. Thanks so much for joining us to talk about SCOTUS's recent decision on affirmative action.
Thanks, Sally. Glad to
I
be
th-
here.
yeah, I think before we start, we should acknowledge that this is going to be controversial, and that our viewpoints might not be shared with all our listeners, and that's fine. What I want to say though to our listeners is that if you disagree, that's okay, but try and listen carefully to what we're saying. Hopefully we've built up you have a lot of confidence in us and what we've said about admissions over time. And so maybe listen as insiders to how we feel about this issue and what we know about it based on the facts and our lived experience with this as our career and beyond it just being a career, right?
Yeah,
So I just thought I would acknowledge that right from the outset, but we welcome, I'm glad people are listening to this. So I'll just start
same.
by saying that. So first, I was hoping though that you could kind of summarize the decision. I mean, a lot of people might not be clear on it. I've heard people interchange affirmative action and quotas. I mean, which is not the case. It's not the same thing. And that's
Sure,
not what we're talking about. So if you could just give like a brief summary, I think that would be helpful.
sure. So this final decision that came out last Thursday through the Supreme Court, it's the two schools, right? It's the college and fellows, the fellows and presidents of Harvard University, and then it's University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Um, and the in 2013, a conservative activist filed a case against Harvard University about its admission practices, claiming that they discriminated, particularly against Asian American students. Um, and so that made its way through the courts. This has already been decided two times in Harvard's favor. And then in 2021, he petitioned the Supreme Court to hear this particular case. They took it. And that is what we saw come out on Thursday. It's important to note that UNC also had a similar outcome one time. They had one decision that was also in favor of their reading processes. And so the truth is, this had already been decided,
Mhm.
but the Supreme Court took it up and decided that they wanted to make a different decision that was a reversal of the lower courts.
Mhm.
Um, One quick thing about this SFFA, that's Students for Fair Admissions, that is Edward Blum's group. He is, as I said, a conservative activist who filed an earlier case against the University of Texas. So he's sort of a firebrand, and I think he would say he would consider himself successful.
Oh, yeah, completely thrilled. And
Yeah,
I've been reading articles that say that they don't see this as the end of the road either, which I think is important to note. Like
I
it's
agree with
kind of
that.
an initial domino to fall, and they can start
Right.
looking at employment practices and all kinds
Sure.
of things. So,
That's right.
not, I mean, that's not our purview today, but I think it
Right.
is important to note that, as well as the fact that, as you pointed out, this overturns decades of precedent. Like,
Decades. So
boom, boom.
that's right. Yeah, this started in with Kennedy's presidency and continued when LBJ became president, and so this is from the 60s. And affirmative action, as we know it, really came out as a result of language that was used in the Civil Rights Act, where it was like, we want the government to act affirmatively with purpose
Mhm.
to end discrimination across gender and race. And so that really, as you said, Sally, this is decades of precedent that should be settled law, but isn't. I think it's also important for people to understand. So we have 9 Supreme Court justices. Justice Roberts is the Chief Justice. This was decided for UNC 6-3 was how the judges voted. So the three women, Kagan, Sotomayor, and Jackson were the three. And then for Harvard, if people are curious, it was a 6-2 because Justice Jackson recused herself. She was on the board at Harvard.
Mhm.
So she took herself out of, but still, I think um, her comments still ring very, they
Yes.
still loom large, right? They're still
Yes.
political.
Yes, I think so. Yeah, without a doubt. There was for people who are interested, there was an interesting dialogue between her and Justice Thomas. So
Thomas. Yes.
yeah. So let's kind of like back up a little bit and talk a little bit about the viewpoint of like college admission offices. Like we all have colleagues or friends who were former colleagues. We know people in the profession who still work in college admission offices. How are they feeling about it? And also, I just kind of want to point out too that if people are curious about kind of looking up more about how people are feeling within the profession of admission, they can go to the NACAC webpage. So National Association of College Admission Counselors has released a couple different statements. So I think that might be interesting to check out too. But so what have you been hearing from your colleagues?
For my colleagues, utter disappointment, frustration. It's important to know that this didn't come as a surprise. So, I think we want our listeners to understand, like, people who work in the admission space, I think, are incredibly thoughtful and compassionate, and are seeking to do their jobs well. And I
Mhm,
think most of the time have a real connection to the work and also to the institutions that they support, right? And so I think once it became clear that the Supreme Court decided to take the case in 2021, it felt like the writing was on the wall.
mhm,
So people have been thinking about this really thoughtfully, but it still really felt, I think, to our colleagues in the admission space, like a gut punch,
mhm,
because even though the decision is now made, and to be frank, there's like a little bit of relief because now we can sort of move on, and they are able to decide on policies that work well for their process. That's really when you read some of the statements that that's when it really um, doesn't it doesn't all fully line up, right? I think in a lot of ways, the majority opinions don't really mirror what actually is going on admission offices. So I think
mhm.
there's a lot of frustration and disappointment. Um, People, as they're looking up some more information on the case, they can look at it's either amicus or amicus. There's a lot of
I think it's amicus. I think
is it
so, but I
amicus?
could be
I've heard
wrong.
it. It's controversial, Sally. The amicus briefs
Yes.
that were filed on the behalf of a number of institutions, NACAC as well, other lobbying bodies that do this work. It is if it's going to be anything like what we have seen happen when other states have done away with affirmative action, this is not something that people who work in admissions want at all, period.
Mhm,
I will
mhm,
also say it's coming at a terrible time in the admission community as offices are really struggling to hold on to their staff. The pandemic made undergraduate admissions really challenging, and this sort of looming over also made it really tough. And so I worry for my colleagues in the profession, like, what is it like to work in an admission office
mhm,
right now? Especially, and I know that we're talking mostly about schools that admit 5, 10, 15, 25%. But, this will still have a ripple effect in other ways,
mhm,
in a broader like space of colleges and universities. So I
mhm.
think they're pretty heartbroken.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that I saw a statement from Angel Perez about from NACAC. He's the
Right, he's
CEO
the
of NACAC,
president.
and he commented that the Supreme Court recognized that colleges can consider students' full identities through lived experiences, which the question is, how are you supposed to do that if you don't look at race? Because we are not in a post-racial society. I mean, I think, and
Absolutely.
like a direct quote is, "We are dismayed at the misunderstanding of both the college admission process and effects of race and racism on educational systems in the USA." Like, it's a little bit of a paraphrase because I was quickly taking notes, but I thought that was a very powerful statement. And I think like people in admissions, they're there. Believe me, you don't make good money in admissions, even if you're at a wealthy institution like Harvard, which you would know, Kyra, or I know people who worked at Stanford. I worked at the
Yeah.
University of Chicago. These are wealthy institutions.
Yes.
You still don't make that much money,
No,
right?
you
So
do
the
not.
reason you're doing this is because you care about it and you believe in
Correct.
education.
Yeah.
So if you are suddenly part of a system that cannot address racial inequality that is not going to be allowed to, I mean, there's got to be a sense of why are we doing this?
Oh, 100%. And I think not only can you not address, but we're now asking you to roll it all back,
Right.
right? Like this is in so many ways the decision, it does not fulfill the promise of higher education, right? It doesn't fulfill the promise of the experience that most students are looking for. It doesn't fulfill the promise of a faculty that's looking forward to generating ideas and
Hmm.
discussion from people with different perspectives. Like it's deeply frustrating. I think the point is true of Mr. Perez, like they don't understand the process. They
Hmm.
also don't understand how kids really pour their hearts out in this process, right? I always thought that it was a real I was always really grateful for the opportunity to be a part of this experience for young people. It's so big. It's a
Hmm.
huge deal, right? Like there's a certain amount of vulnerability that happens in an application that I always just felt really honored to be a part of. And it is sort of like, yeah, you can talk about your experience, but you can't incorporate your full identity.
Hmm.
That's terrible. It's a horrific message. I
Hmm.
think you and I can agree that this is happening in other sectors, right? Like this is showing up in other ways in our culture, in our society broadly.
Hmm.
And to see kids be stripped of their opportunity to be authentic and fully themselves in this process is truly devastating.
Hmm. And
Misses the mark in a big way.
yeah, and I think for people who say, oh, but is it fair? I mean, I would say, this is also a misunderstanding of the college admission process. It is, and at these highly selective institutions, students get in for all kinds of reasons, right? Like including at some schools, legacy is still powerful, although that might go away. Certainly being major donor, and I'm not even talking about varsity blues where it was done illegally. I'm talking about
Sure,
completely legal major donations.
absolutely.
So you have a student who would
Athletics,
athletics is huge. And by the way, for people who think that athletics benefit students of color, no, the athletic recruiting process at these highly selective institutions benefits primarily white students. I think that's very important to note as well. So it's not all merit, academic merit. That is simply not, there is no like pure process of academic
sure.
merit that this is some exception to. That is not how it works.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with that, Sally. And not only is it not merit, it never has been
Right.
about merit, right? Like,
Oh, it used to
and
be worse. It used to be
it
like,
used to
I
be
mean, it's
worse.
take a look at John F. Kennedy's and George W. Bush's transcripts. They're on the internet
Yeah, it's
somewhere.
right,
Like, it's like, did you go to the right boarding school? Do you have the right name? Yeah, you can
right,
come to Yale or Harvard or whatever. We don't care. Do you
exactly.
have
It
C's?
does it does boggle the mind, right?
Yeah.
And I think that in today's world, if you and I looked at that transcript, we'd be like, I not only is it not appropriate, but also are these people prepared, right?
Right.
Like are they prepared to come and be successful? But yeah, it's never been a meritocracy.
Yeah.
Never.
Yeah.
That's a giant lie. But I am really disheartened by this idea of like, yeah, you can still sort of talk about race, but really it has to be about determination and resilience and grit. It's the whole sort of bootstrap mentality. And we know that that's like a fallacy, right? Because not everybody has boots.
Hmm.
Um, but also like it forces the student to sort of now see themselves as like, I have to sell myself. I have to sell my trauma. I have to
Hmm.
sell my bad story, right?
Hmm.
If I can't talk about how this has affected me truly around my identity, I have to now sort of gin it up so that this is really, you understand my pain.
Hmm.
Um, like, what are we doing? What are we asking people to
Well,
do?
it which also leaves out the fact that if a student comes from a school where maybe they're a student of color, but they're part of the majority, they
Right.
don't know that this is something that colleges are interested in,
That's
right?
right.
Like
That's
I mean, I worked at two private high schools, and I worked occasionally with students who, were did come from some of these low income communities where they were part of the majority, and then they would come to our school and be part of a minority. And when I would sort of talk to some of them about well, write about your experience, write about what it's like maybe to go to Chadwick from your neighborhood. And they're like, oh, the colleges are going to think that's interesting. I thought I was supposed to write about like, the fact that I like was part of the Key Club. Like they just like they didn't. And I'm like, believe me, the colleges are going to find that interesting. Like the
I
colleges will
100%
find that
agree.
very interesting. And
Very
so they're
interesting.
not going to know. I mean, at this school, like I had a 40-to-1 counselor student ratio. And but most of their friends didn't have a counselor who met with them, who
No,
could tell
they
them
had
these
a
things.
380 to 1,
Right.
400 to 1,
500 to
600 to
1.
1.
So yeah,
Yes.
in some cases. Exactly. So I always think, I mean, it's just such a, as you said, sometimes they don't have any boots to start out with. I think
No,
that's really important
they
to
just
note.
really, I mean, many don't. And, I mean, I think that there are also, we are talking primarily about, I think you and I, just in casual conversation that we're having publicly, are
Mhm,
talking about mostly Black students, right? But this is also Latino students. These are certain, ethnic groups within the overall Asian community, right?
mhm,
This is also, nobody talks about Indigenous students. This is
mhm,
about Native American students. Like, this is about a whole host of people for whom the impact is super detrimental. It just
mhm,
is like, and it's just unfair. I
mhm,
think a lot about, again, the promise of higher education and like what my kids are most excited about when I counsel them and we're working on their applications, or I'm talking to a family about who's new to this country, they're educated elsewhere, but you know, the promise of higher education, and these 6 people turned it all around in a way that didn't take into consideration at all what students are really excited about and looking forward to. And
mhm,
it just is like one more way, I think, in which it's really obvious that like children are not a priority in our country.
mhm,
We're banning books, we're doing all of these things that really chip away at their autonomy, their ability to have lived experiences, to be educated, to be exposed to different perspectives, to understand what it means to be uncomfortable and work through that. Like, right, we're stripping all of that away.
mhm.
Um, and I don't see where the good is.
Yeah. I mean, I think, yeah, all this discussion of woke ideology, it's like, well, so are your foundations of belief so weak that your students simply reading a book that disagrees or hearing from someone else that there's another perspective, everything's going
It
to
will shake it,
crumble?
right? It
I
will shake.
mean,
Will it shake it? Why?
yeah. Why? Yeah, exactly. Like, is that, isn't that is part of the point of going to college? The other thing I'll say is at most of the students that I talk to want a diverse college experience. And this
Same.
is going to take away. So even the majority students themselves want diversity. And I hear that from a whole variety of students. And this is going to not only potentially make it, well, it is absolutely going to make it harder to bring in a class that at least represents our society. It's also going to, I think, drive students away who might otherwise apply, who come from these underrepresented groups. They might be like, I'm
Absolutely.
going to apply to Howard. I don't want to go to Harvard if they don't want me. That's an uncomfortable,
Right.
distressing situation to be
Absolutely.
1%, to be in classes where I'm the only person who looks like me.
Right. I agree wholeheartedly. Yes.
Yeah. So I think so that's segment one. So let's go ahead, Kyra, and take a break. It's too bad we don't have much to say or think about that, like, but I guess we'll be able to fill our second
We'll be
segment.
able to fill our
I
time.
guess we'll be able to. So
Yeah.
anyway, so
Sally.
oh,
No, I was just gonna say, can I pick back up on something you just said?
oh, please do. Please do.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm
Pick right
Yeah.
back up on it.
Okay. I think what you said is so critical, right? So how hard it is to be one of few. I mean, I'm a graduate of Northwestern University, super proud Wildcat, but I graduated from the music school. I was one Black person in my entire graduating class. Certainly, as a classical musician, that those were spaces I was used to being in, right or wrong. I just realized this is my reality, and if I want to excel in my instrument, this is what I need to do. But to your point, it is a really hard sell for a lot of people to be like, yeah, come on in. There's only 3 of us, but it's great. It's like really challenging to live in that space, because ultimately what it always does is people look at you and say, why are you here? You're only here for whatever. And I'm like, well, I'm here because I'm pretty great. Right.
Right.
But it is like the amount of stress to your exactly to your point, I could see why people would need to be convinced and then decide it's not worth it, maybe.
Mhm.
So if
Yeah.
that's just, a Black student going, what is it like for, a student from the Hmong community? What is it like for, a student, from an indigenous community who's lived on a reservation? Like, what is that like when they don't see other people who look like them and they're in spaces where now they are the only? It's incredibly challenging.
Yeah, yeah. And I just ask, like, as a white woman, I just ask you to imagine moments when, I mean, this happened to me. I'll just say it, when I was at the University of Chicago and I was the only woman on the leadership team, and there was one Black man on the leadership team, and we would get sidelined sometimes in conversations. And I just thought, I'm sorry, but the only reason this could be happening is because he is Black and I am a woman. It was,
Sure.
I mean, it was just like, it was and these are people who, it was happening with people who would never have wanted to do that. It was not going to be a conscious situation. They were not consciously trying to do this. But
Right.
I had to speak up and say, excuse me, are we part of this discussion?
Right.
And
Right.
which of course then created defensiveness. So in no way am I comparing my experience to yours, but I think in part, this
There
is
are
my
definitely
insight
similarities.
into it. Yeah.
That's right.
This
That's
is
right.
my insight, and I ask other people to try and have that insight if at all possible.
I would agree with that. I also think your point about students, like we can say, I mean, the majority of students that I work with here at Bright Horizons College Coach are white students. They're phenomenal. They're good people. They also don't want to be in a super
Right.
homogenous environment,
Right.
right? Many of my Asian American students don't either.
Mhm.
Many of them are like, look, this has been my whole upbringing. This has been my whole reality. I want to branch out a little bit. I want to meet somebody like it. So I think that there's also this perception out there that this isn't what students want. Like, or this is what students want. And I
Yeah.
think what's really become clear to me overwhelmingly is this is not what my students want.
Mhm.
They do want the opportunity to meet people who come from different cultures and have different backstories. And it's really critical.
Yeah. Yeah. It is interesting. I mean, I've talked to Asian students who say, well, I want a school with more diversity. And I'm like, well, it's pretty diverse. It's not super white. Like, I assume immediately that what they
Yeah.
mean is like, I'm like, well, it's 50% white. Like, this school's only, I mean, that's pretty diverse to only be
Yeah.
50% white. And they're
Sure.
like, oh, it's too many Asian students. And I've heard this from Asian American students.
Same.
And it was just very interesting to me, but they want that broader group. And certainly
Yeah.
white students that I work with say it all the time. It's very important to them. And I feel like there's a recognition of students who attend these highly selective schools, at least, probably well beyond
Right.
that,
Right.
that they are going to do better in business if they can interact with people from different backgrounds.
There's a real capitalist interest in,
Right.
in wanting diversity. Like if that's my only in with somebody with a listener here, trust me when I say there is a real capitalist win for trying to make situations diverse in as many ways as possible. That also includes race, right?
Mhm.
Like you can access more people, you can access more money. Full stop period. You can have a bigger audience. Like that is the capitalist angle around this as well. It isn't for those of you who may feel, that this is just around like some sort of specific ideology or feelings. Like no, there's actually like a real financial and economic engine that also runs better when we
Mhm.
are in more diverse settings,
Yeah.
period.
Yeah. I don't I mean, there's a very funny 30 Rock episode, and I know that's about when the Lehman Brothers goes under. And so they bring in all the Lehman Brother intern bros, and they're all exactly the same, and they run around in a pack together. And obviously, this is an exaggeration for humor,
Sure.
but I think it's kind of an interesting, like, symbol of what can sometimes happen already at these really elite firms, and that I could see that being just so much worse with this. Like, it's going to be, we need diverse leaders in society, don't we? So if you're cutting off any sort of a pipeline for underrepresented students of color to these
Yeah.
elite institutions, and we can debate the justice within the higher education. I'm not going to say
Sure.
that that's
Right.
fair, but where we are now, it's a capitalist system. Certain institutions are given certain kinds of priority. Like, so then what's going to happen? Because the other thing too, I mean, I discussed this with you another time, Kyra, and I looked it up again and I couldn't find the study, but there's some pretty clear evidence that when they did like resumes to some of these firms, and when the name was sort of a fairly, like, let's use Justice Jackson, right? Like, you know, they use names like, let's say somebody's name was Ebony Jackson
Sure.
versus Emily Jones.
Right.
And Emily Jones, in the study they did, might have even had not quite as strong qualification. Certainly they were still qualified, but maybe not quite as strong. Gee, guess who got the callback? Guess who got the callback? But when Ebony Jackson had attended Harvard, Yale, Princeton, etc., some of that disappeared. Not all of it, I want to be very clear, but in this one study, at least there were more callbacks. And so I thought that is really interesting as well. We have the system that we have. This was going a
Yeah.
small way to addressing it. And I want to emphasize small. And now, and yeah,
small.
very small,
So
but the
small.
Supreme Court has now gotten rid of that.
Right.
So
Sally, the next time I see you, I'll tell you about the story of getting my house ready to be reassessed, to have our, you know, to reapply for a mortgage. This was obviously not recently because the mortgage rates are not great,
right.
but you know, during the pandemic, and what my husband, who's white, those of you who watch the or listen to the pod regularly, you'll remember he was the architect. He and I were on together, and what he did to our house, because we were concerned about the appearance of a mixed race family. Yes, in 2022, yes, 2021, living in Chicago, and the kind of like discrimination potentially that would open us up to. So completely stripping away all sense of personality, ethnic, you know, background, race, in an effort. Like, this stuff is real and it's insidious, right? So we have it in college admission. We're trying to just sort of neutralize, race neutral, right? We see it in the way that I set up my home to be reassessed. Like, it is very insidious. What you said something interesting, which is about like a pipeline to leadership, right? And I think it's really important that people know, if you haven't, I don't know how many times to say this, everybody, but if you haven't had the chance to, Sally and I were talking about a podcast, finish this one, but on the New York Times, The Daily, they, you know, I don't always listen to them, but for this particular topic, they do a great job. But you know, there's any number of articles to read about the decision. And there's a really interesting footnote from Chief Justice Roberts, who I should tell everybody wrote the majority statement, which is big, right? And so one of the things that he talks about is that this end to affirmative action or race conscious admissions for undergrad, for institutions of higher learning, should not apply to service academies or the military. I think it's like, people need to hear me when I say that, because essentially the reasoning is, we need diversity. We need the people within the ranks of our military to see themselves in leadership. And I find that to be so insulting, distressing. It's just disappointing. Uh-oh. Am I frozen, Sally?
No, I mean, you're freezing, you're slow, but
Okay.
keep going because we can still
Okay.
hear you. Yeah.
Okay, great. So what I was just saying is that I really find that that footnote about the military, to me, makes this seem like a decision that doesn't have a lot of merit, right? It feels like this is a decision that's more about the culture wars instead of being about legal precedent.
I completely agree. I mean, I think obviously the military is a pipeline to leadership, absolutely.
Yes.
But are you
Yes.
really saying that then that's not the case in higher education? I mean, like that's the only implication. That's the only sort of statement that would make what Robert said, I think, fair or meaningful. And it
Yeah.
clear but we know that's not true. We know that the military is not the only important source of leadership in this country. In fact, it's very important that it not be, right? Like, we're not a democracy if the military is the only outlet towards
That's right.
leadership.
It should not Right. We want it to be one of the
One
sources,
of
but
them.
we don't, to your point, absolutely. So I think it also leaves me as a person of color feeling and cold, makes me feel like, well, I'm sort of good enough to be considered in this way for the military, but I'm really not good enough in this way to be considered for just regular higher education. I think that's hard. It's a hard pill to swallow,
Yeah, yeah,
you
it
know.
really is.
Yeah.
So we'll just go ahead. We're just going to keep going and do what
Okay.
like we have about 8 minutes left, with like I think gives us time to talk about more of this, which I think is great. I think
Okay.
that one of the big questions. Oh, by the way, though, before I go on, I do want to say that I don't want to say that we're changing our mind about the fact that you can get a good education at any huge number of schools and do great things from there. I just think it's very notable that at certain firms, if you're a student of color or an underrepresented student of color, these schools are very important pipelines. That is not so much the
Yeah,
case if you are part of the majority population, right? So
that's right.
I did want to say that, and we're not changing our mind on that.
We're
Uh,
not changing our mind on that. We are in
Not at
lockstep
all.
with that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
that's a really important to note. Now,
Yeah.
what I want to kind of transition though, because I know that people are going to be saying, well, I mean, this isn't so bad. Like, California did this, Texas did this. Like, there are ways around this. Why can't we use income as a proxy, for example?
Sure.
Right? Which on its face sounds great. Absolutely. If you're in poverty, getting to college is tough. It's just going to be tough, period. Right? So, yeah, it sounds on its face like a good idea, but I was just wondering if you had some thoughts on that.
I think that some of these solutions that people come up with are a way to appease themselves, right? And to make themselves feel better about a really impactful decision. I don't care how many states did this before. I don't care how prepared people were or were not about this coming down. Um, what we've seen from other states that have done this is that, sure, some of them they've been able to come up with smart solutions that have helped them, but they haven't solved the problem. And in most cases, um, the population of students that this really hurts have not risen to the same level of attendance as they did before these policies were stripped away.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I've heard people be like, well, but University of California, like they got back to where they wanted to. And I'm like, but it took years.
And a
It took
lot
a
of
really
money, by the
and a
way.
lot of money. And like we still know that the students applying to the UCs, particularly like Hispanic students, does not come close to matching the um the demographics around high school graduates, who are Latino or Hispanic, however you want to define yourself
Mm-hmm.
within that category. And so it's like, sure, people can pat themselves on the back and say there's a way, but the way is long. The
Mm-hmm.
way puts a big burden on these students in the meantime. The way is expensive, as you said. And again, really forces students, in my opinion, to not be their full selves, not have their full selves appreciated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's really important to note. And I want to point people, I found an article in the Wall Street Journal about this. I think we can agree that the Wall Street Journal is not a liberal rag. I
It's
think
true.
that,
She's a great reporter, though. Melissa Korn is
yeah,
a
no, I mean, Wall Street Journal has
yeah,
fact-based reporting. I
of
don't
course.
agree with their opinions, but their
Yes.
articles are well researched and well
Yeah.
reported. Yeah, so not saying absolutely worth reading, as I did, but I think, clearly we're not talking about the Nation, we're not talking about Mother Jones, we're talking about the Wall Street Journal.
That's right.
And she did a great article on how, especially if you look at like UC Berkeley and UCLA, in spite of all their efforts, they have not gotten back to where they were, or as you said, even close to a full representation. Right. Same thing with the University of Michigan, same thing with the Texas systems. And in terms of like low income students, for example, obviously bringing in like having outreach to students who are underprivileged is a great idea. But there are so many low-income students in states like California and Texas who are white, that they could just, you're still not solving the problem
No.
of having, nor do, of having like some kind of equal representation. And frankly, neither are all Black students or Latino students poor. So don't we
No.
want full diversity?
We do want full
Like,
diversity. Well, that's the other side of this too, is like it gets to be a slippery slope when people tie, like they try to use income as a replacement for race, because that makes it seem like they're equivalent. It's a false equivalency, right?
mhm,
Like, I didn't grow up poor, right? Like I am Black and I
mhm,
did not grow up poor. My daughter is biracial, will not grow up poor, is not growing up poor. It's not an automatic. They're not on
mhm,
the same field necessarily.
mhm.
So I do find it frustrating when people say that. It's like it's not that is important, and it's not quite what we're talking about here,
Right.
right? It just isn't the same thing. It's not the same solution that we're trying to solve for. Um,
Mhm,
so I don't know, Sally. It's a tough time, right? Like it's a really tough time. I wonder, can we talk to students about maybe like what this means for them? Do you want to
mhm.
do that?
Yeah, let's
Like,
do that. We have just a few minutes left.
yeah. I mean, the way that I look at it, and I think you would agree, everybody, Sally and I have worked together for like a decade and a half. But I think you and I feel similarly, and like we don't want to tamp down our students' choice of schools, right? We don't want them to try to be someone that they're not. We don't want them to feel like they have to hide. And so, to me, sort of what I'm talking about with my students, quite frankly, if they bring it up, not many have brought it up. I haven't really proactively
Mhm,
brought it up with my students, but it's like, you know what? Let's just focus on finding appropriate schools where you think you'd like to land, that offer you, as much as we know, the kind of environment that you wish for. I have said to a couple of families, if this is important to you, you should be looking at the statements that were put out by whatever universities you're looking into, or offices of admission, to sort of see how full throated their support or lack of has been. And then you can decide. And that we're still going to really focus on writing insightful essays that are, or working on towards insightful, well written essays that share as much of the students' experience that's appropriate within the word count,
mhm. Yeah.
right? And for students that may, for all my Jack and Jill families out there, for all of my kiddos who might have gotten a scholarship or done volunteer work with the AKAs, right, a Black sorority, like any of those markers that come up that may indicate racial or ethnic um participation. I don't want people to stop doing that. Don't stop going to Chinese school. Don't
Mhm,
stop talking about how, as a Jewish student, you're working, and doing Hebrew school. I think
mhm,
all of that's still really, really important for everybody.
mhm.
Everyone.
Everybody, this is part of your lived experience, and
That's
that
right.
is something that the colleges are allowed to consider.
That's right.
Right. So, but
Yeah.
you got to do it individually. So, all right. Well, I do have to wrap this up. To all our listeners who are still here, who are still listening, I want to really thank you. You can tell this is something that Kyra and I really care a lot about. All right. And I want to thank you also to Michelle Clifton. Do join us next week when fellow host Shannon Vasconcelos will be answering listener questions, as well as interviewing Karen Christoph, Vice President and Dean of Admission at Colorado College, as part of our Niche College series. And remember, you don't have to listen to our shows live. Every show is accessible 24/7 on Voice America. Don't forget, we're here every Thursday, 4 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Pacific.